Well, hello, everyone. I think we'll get started. A very warm welcome. My name is Gretchen Kerr, and I'm one of the co-directors of E-Alliance, along with Guylaine Demers and Anne Peguerero. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the next in E-Alliance's Equity Matters series of webinars. Today's topic is anti-racism policy, pedagogy, and practice in Ontario University athletics. What's next? Our featured speaker today, no stranger to those of us on the Canadian sport landscape, Dr. Janelle Joseph, who is a professor in critical studies of race in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education at the University of Toronto. I'm so delighted to be able to call her a colleague. She is founder and director of the Indigeneity, Diaspora, Equity, and Anti-Racism in Sport Research Lab, otherwise known as IDEAS, and co-author of 3 books related to race, sport, education, and Black communities in Canada. Dr. Joseph's current research focuses on gender, equity, decolonization, and imposter phenomenon. And today's discussion will be facilitated by Deniece Bell, who is a health and physical education teacher and graduate student at the University of Toronto. She is currently pursuing a master's in kinesiology with an emphasis on equity in sport, and has been part of a number of initiatives and developments for the advancement of sport via collaborations with OPHEA, the Ontario Physical and Health Education Association, the IDEAS Research Lab at U of T, Motus Training Studios, and other grassroots programs. Danielle's research is focused on decolonizing fitness and finding ways to support anti-racism in sport. She is also an LGBTQ2S+ advocate. So welcome everyone, and I will now hand it over to Deniece.
Or good afternoon at this point. Thank you for joining us and taking part in this very important discussion. I'm going to ask Dr. Joseph just to start with discussing the OUA Antiracism Report. It came out in October of 2021, and just a little bit of a brief background if people are not familiar with it, some of the processes that you went through and the challenges that existed.
Sure, thanks, Deniece. So yeah, it was about a year process from October 2020 to October 2021. And it emerged through conversations between the IDEAS Research Lab and the OUA, but really conversations have been happening for many, many years before that, particularly between Black coaches of the OUA, who ultimately formed the Black Canadian Coaches Association, and many other leaders across many campuses who had been talking about anti-racism initiatives. But in 2020, there was this groundswell of energy around anti-racism. So we started in the fall. We went through an ethical review process, and we launched in February, aligned with Black History Month, questionnaire to the entire 11,000 plus membership of the OUA. We really wanted to target student athletes, coaches, and administrators and get a sense of what are the demographics, racial demographics across the OUA, but also what are the experiences of racism and efforts towards anti-racism that are already happening. You know, anecdotally, we knew a lot. I've had conversations with many different athletes, coaches, and administrators, but there hasn't been formal research as has been done in the NCAA for many decades. That research hasn't been done in Canada. So we wanted to start with Ontario, with the biggest conference, and really get a sense of, you know, what is happening in the OUA with respect to race. So we asked some of these demographic census questions as well as questions about experience. And then we followed that up with a couple of months of interviews and focus groups. So we were able to touch 107 people across all of the different universities, and we touched on as many different sports as we could, to just really dig deep, once we had the results from the questionnaire, dig deep into some of these experiences so that we could understand what's happening. I'm a qualitative researcher, I'm a storyteller, and the evidence from the questionnaire was not enough for me. I wanted to know the nitty-gritty, the detail. So it was a typical qualitative and quantitative process. And as you mentioned, the report came out in the fall of 2021. Oh, you asked about the challenges. I think, some of the challenges of doing this kind of research, they are complicated, particularly because there have been so few formal conversations about race in our sport settings, So some of the questions, we realized that because people didn't have the language facility, the experience, they really couldn't articulate either what had happened to them or things that they had witnessed. There wasn't a lot of facility with talking about anti-racism. So that was certainly, one of the challenges and also one of the findings. Another challenge was about tackling the complexities of what's next, what we're doing right today. Critical race theory is the framework that I use, and we emphasize a few different basic principles. One is intersectionality, that we can't look at race without looking at these other different dimensions of how oppression operates, how colonialism operates, and what people experience on a day-to-day basis. But another one of our fundamental principles is that our research must be transformative. So we're not just asking questions for question's sake, so it can sit in a report, it can be on a shelf. We're really trying to transform organizations. So I think the challenge is that what's next question. Now that we have this report, what can institutions do to actually implement change now that we know what we know about the experiences of racism?
Sure, that's full of more discussion that can come about from that response. Thank you so much. From those challenges and replicating this research and the findings, we used Ontario University Athletics. What were the main findings that you found, and talked about some of those challenges? For example, COVID and being in the middle of a pandemic. How did that influence your data collection? And do you think it played a role in how the findings were interpreted, or your thoughts on that?
For sure. I can answer those two questions separately. So firstly, in terms of the findings, I'll say, after the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020 and the subsequent global anti-racism protests and uprisings, I think you would be hard pressed to find someone in Ontario University Athletics who would say that there's no racism. Right? I think we've seen the tide shift a little bit where people are aware that racism is happening. But what people weren't aware of is where it was happening. We still heard from lots of people that, oh, we understand there's racism in the OUA, but that happens at the Greater Toronto Area schools where there's lots more racialized athletes, or, oh, we know there's racism happening, but that probably happens at the very remote or more northern universities in remote communities where there's only a few racialized athletes and they experience racism. No one wanted to say racism happens here. And so the idea, particularly among people who hadn't experienced it personally, among our white student athletes, coaches, and administrators, there was a lot of discourse about racism happening at another place, at another school, in another city. And so one of the main findings was racism is happening everywhere. At every institution across our province, there are experiences of racism. There are athletes, coaches, administrators who are experiencing challenges, either with recruitment and promotion, with feelings of safety. They're experiencing regular oppression in the classroom, in their communities, et cetera. So that's a really clear take-home message, is that it's happening everywhere across our Ontario universities. And we ended up breaking up the report into three main sections. So the first one focuses on racial demographics, and the second is about experiences of racism, and the third is about knowledge of racism, how and why it operates. So I'll touch on the first one in terms of the racial demographics. This really helped us to put some of the numbers to things that we knew anecdotally for many years, discussions around the OUA. The report made it really clear that there's a disproportion between the number of racialized versus white student athletes, coaches, and administrators. So what we saw, now we have the numbers, we know that according to the survey, so we had 5,000 people respond to the survey, and we have 29% racialized athletes versus just 22% racialized coaches and just under 20% racialized administrators. And interestingly, among those who are racialized, we see a much closer correlation between, for example, the percentage of South Asian and East Asian athletes, coaches, and administrators versus Black and biracial. So those who identify as Black or biracial, those individuals don't seem to be getting the same opportunities to move into coaching, to move into from assistant coach or part-time coach to head coach and full-time positions, or into those administrator roles. So we see this kind of gap, right? There's this percentage decrease, but particularly within some communities. And unfortunately, we weren't able to get responses from many Indigenous coaches or administrators. And we can guess that that's because they are few in number, but we don't know. Frankly, we didn't have any Indigenous administrators respond to our survey. So there's still lots of work to be done in this area of, what are the racial demographics across the OUA, and, who's getting opportunities and how could we nurture those opportunities. The second part of the report focuses on experiences of racism. And, I don't necessarily want to dwell on the negative experiences because it seems to me that so much of our attention goes to racialized athletes or racialized coaches and what they have experienced, and not enough attention goes onto what can we do to change. But having said that, we absolutely need to make it clear what is happening on the ground. So we have lots of examples of negative racist assumptions that were being made of athletes. We heard again and again from white coaches that they followed a so-called normal path into their head coach job. They played university, some of them played nationally or professionally, and then they were tapped on the shoulder for a coaching job or a head coaching job, and then some of them moved into an athletic director type of position. In contrast, some of our Black coaches, our biracial coaches, were really clear that even though they had played at university, they had played professionally, they had master's degrees, they had coaching certifications, despite their qualifications, they were not getting those shoulder taps or mentorship opportunities or being hired, those job offers when they were interviewing. And so this, idea that, these are the things that you need to do to progress, to be promoted within the OUA, there's a real discrepancy between people's racial identities and what they were experiencing on the ground. We also know that even for athlete recruitment, we have a distribution graph within our report about white versus racialized athletes in different sports. And we know that some sports are more racialized than others. Certainly tennis, football, soccer, and fencing come to mind, and basketball. But the racial makeup of those sports is quite different. For example, with East Asians, very few in football and basketball, many in fencing. And so when we say, some of our sports are diverse, yes, we can say that, first of all, but only some. So most of the sports are predominantly white. And then those that are diverse, what are the actual racial demographics within those sports and the opportunities for everyone to experience the sports and to reach their full potential and to bring success to their Ontario universities? We're missing out on so much talent. There is a leaky talent pipeline, and we would really like to address that. So we have that section in the report on the experiences. And then, one of the frustrating things is that many athletes told us that they don't say anything. Racialized athletes who experience racism, they stay silent, they suffer silently. And this has an effect on their mental health, and I'm sure it has an effect on their athletic performance and their academic performance as well. And the reason that they suffer silently is because they've experienced again and again that they are misunderstood, that they are not respected, that the path to creating a racial complaint is not clear, and that they are not believed. And so, we have this kind of discrepancy between lots of racism happening, some athletes kind of being stalled and not being able to express that, don't know who to turn to, or when they turn to their predominantly white coaches, they are told that that, you know, they didn't realize that this was having such a big impact on them, but then there's no follow-up, there's nothing else to do. And so we're not really taking care, particularly of our racialized student athletes and racialized coaches, not taking care of them in the way that they deserve to be cared for. So I really want to emphasize this idea of, you know, that we can do better, and that we'll get to, you know, the tools for change and recommendations in a few minutes. But in terms of the broad range of overt, obvious, really aggressive racism and the subtle, hidden, systemic racism, it's all happening. And there we had lots of different examples of people's experiences with the barriers that they're facing. And then that next section is about the knowledge. So we wanted to dig into how does this happen? Why does it happen? What are the kinds of stereotypes that are still perpetuated today? Stereotypes about Black and Indigenous athletes, low intelligence, or hyper-durability. We heard from many athletes that, you know, they were getting injured, but they were not believed, or they didn't get the physio or the rest time that they needed because, and I quote, Black girls are just so strong. And so that's, you know, another example of how this racism is also gendered racism, and it's ableist. And, you know, there are a number of different factors that are happening at the same time that work against athletes in particular bodies. So we looked at what are the structures that are going to end up perpetuating, enabling, or allowing people to overlook racism? And we found that, you know, there's many community members that don't fully understand how white privilege is operating, or even what racism is. And, you know, it's really unfortunate because these are the people who are in the positions of power who we would expect to be able to do something. If, you know, a coach is reporting, an assistant coach is reporting to their head coach, or an athlete is reporting to an athletic administrator, if people are dismissed or their experiences are denied, then we kind of have a broken system. And we know that many of the institutions, they were lacking transparent anti-racism policies or reporting practices. And in some cases, that's for good reason, for confidentiality. In other cases, it just means that there's no clear pathway. And so people don't know what to do when they experience slurs on the court, or when they're traveling to another place. This was a particular issue around the OUA because there's so much travel, right? And people from one organization in another organization's space or another institution's space. And, you know, wondering, you know, if I experience a slur at an away game, well, who am I supposed to talk to? Can my coach help me? Can their coach help me? And there have been some remedial conversations among coaches and between teams, and I'm really happy to see that. But in many cases, athletes just gave up because they didn't know who to talk to or what to do. And this idea that people won't be heard, or that they have to only lean on each other, that racialized athletes, student athletes are leaning on each other for support. We have to recognize the cost that comes with this, right? If there's a lack of knowledge, and one thing we heard again and again is that I don't see it. So this kind of an ableist and visual orientation towards racism. Like, racism is something you should be able to see. And if I don't see it, if I haven't witnessed it, if no one's disclosed it to me, then how do I know it exists? And this kind of denial of racism was a really frustrating issue for many people to live with. So, you know, in terms of the racial demographics, the experiences, and the knowledge of racism, we found that there's a problem. And, you know, we want to be able to address this problem. And, you know, I feel, even as I'm saying it to you, I know that there's lots of people on this call who are doing amazing work and who understand that this is not the totality of what is happening in the OUA. So obviously lots of great things are happening, but my area of focus is on the not so great things. It's on, you know, how could we do better? And so in terms of understanding how racism operates in the OUA, we absolutely can do better. You were asking about COVID, and, you know, doing this research now in particular, I think was, you know, a privilege in many ways, because, or at least, you know, when we started in the spring of 2021, at that time, there were no sports happening. There was no action on the court or field. And in a way, I think that gave people some time, some space to really think about change, to think about how things might be different, to engage with our surveys and our interviews. I imagine if we had done it in a regular year, people might have been busy and it would have been harder, I think, to get that buy-in and that engagement. So we were absolutely able to reach a broader spectrum of students and coaches and administrators, I think, because they were not engaged in championships as they normally would have been. But also with respect to racism, we can't ignore the anti-East Asian racism that was happening across Ontario during COVID. And, you know, having done this project at a different time, I wonder whether those East Asian athletes and coaches and administrators would have been so forthcoming or would have had such clear examples of how they had experienced discrimination. But unfortunately, we heard again and again from people who were being denied, student athletes being denied housing or experiencing discrimination in their residence. There was an assumption in some communities that it was that first that East Asian athletes were international athletes, and then second, that international athletes were bringing COVID into local communities. In many cases, those were both false assumptions. But this is, you know, the lived experience of just being on the street, just being out of your dorm room and on campus at many of our Ontario universities was particularly challenging for some East Asian athletes. I heard from some who essentially, like, you know, went out in disguise. We're all wearing masks these days, but, you know, to put on a hoodie and a mask and to hope that people don't abuse you when you're out on campus, like that's not okay. And it's not necessarily or specifically a sport problem, but I do want to highlight the role that our sport communities can play in supporting each other, in understanding, in believing people, and in supporting them, especially for something like, you know, being kicked out of your housing or being not able to find housing. I would hope that student athletes could go to their coaches or could go to administrators and get the supports, and particularly mental health supports that they need, that is culturally relevant and understands deeply the experience that they're having. So, you know, it's a time, this COVID pandemic, but in a way, I initially thought that it was going to be a barrier for research. And I think with both of those examples, it actually opened up different avenues of exploration for us.
I wonder, thank you. That was a great synopsis and capture of the main findings, and definitely things that we could unpack in greater and longer conversations. The word racism and how that affected administrators, coaches, and student athletes, and what were you noticing through the process with student athlete activists? Because as you mentioned, this is at the height. We've come off of a big awareness of racism and George Floyd and those incidents that are affecting how people are perceiving what's happening or seeing what's happening. And then student athletes are now using their space and sport to exact some change. So tell me a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, I think we are in a moment of kind of a pendulum swing. You know, student activists have been active across Canada for many, many decades. So activism on campus is not necessarily new, but the groundswell, particularly within sports, has taken on a new flavor, I'd say, in the last few years. And so we absolutely have seen student athletes from across Ontario being active in different ways. So in some cases, creating organizations on their campus. You know, at the University of Toronto, we have the BIPOC Varsity Association that's being led by racialized student athletes with many different other demographic characteristics. And they are really advocating for change on campus and within our Faculty of Kinesiology. But then we have, you know, at other organizations, I know at Queen's, there's a BIPOC Varsity Network, and they're working to connect current students with alumni and with other community members. And so thinking a bit broader than just the campus. Up at Nipissing, Tyjon Eccles and Graham created Athletes for Change, which is a cross youth sports organization. So he's connecting all of the different student athlete organizations so that they can leverage their resources together. So it's happening at many different levels, both formally and informally. But a few things that I've noticed about this generation of student athletes is that they are social media savvy. And so they are very aware of how to connect with each other and how to leverage video and images and quickly, how to get the message across really quickly to each other. And, you know, those student athlete groups cannot do their work without the buy-in and support of the administration. And so what I'm seeing across Ontario is administrators, athletic directors who are predominantly white, sitting down with these predominantly racialized student athletes and listening and asking, so what is it that you need? And finding ways to answer their calls. And so it's a really wonderful opportunity for cross-generational, cross-racial conversations. And the student athletes are so aware, they're so savvy in terms of the theory and the praxis of anti-racism. And they understand that these are structural issues. And so in many cases, they're advocating for bursaries. We know that the OUA in September created the Black and Indigenous Heritage Student Athlete Bursary. So, you know, on various campuses, they know that this exists and they're asking their administrators, how can we get this? Do we have policies in place? What do we need to leverage in order to make this actually happen for us and our communities? They are really trying to create mentorship programs. They're working with their administrators to create internships and positions so that they can move into coaching, move into sport management, move into leadership. So they're understanding that they are an underrepresented group, and the Human Rights Code of Canada, it demands that they have equal access to opportunity. And so if the statistics, the demographic statistics of their institution does not bear out to that equal opportunity, they are asking, how can we make this different? And so I think, you know, a few generations ago, though the student athletes were not as vocal, they were not holding administrators accountable in the same ways. They were not putting people on blast on social media, but that's what we have today. And so, you know, in a way, I think there's a lot of good that can come from that, because it's real-time, immediate dialogue between, you know, a first-year student and an athletic director who in some cases might be 40 years older than them, but have a lot of experience within sport. And we can actually start nurturing these relationships. You know, I've done research recently with the Black Canadian Coaches Association, and they are in their second year now of a Black female coach mentorship program. And in speaking with some of the mentors and mentees in that program, it's really clear that Black coaches can benefit from mentorship relationships, mentorship networks, having someone to call. In so many cases, athletes and coaches are the only one on their team, sometimes the only one at their university, particularly for a Black head coach. You might be the only Black head coach at your university. You might be the only Black coach in volleyball in your province. So if you are experiencing living as the only one, then you might not see yourself in that next level of opportunity, in that head coaching position, or in an athletic director or a managerial position. And so if you don't see people who look like you, you know, it's very clear now that representation matters. You know, many studies have borne this out across business, across education. So, you know, getting back to your question about the student athlete activism, I think the student athletes know this. They know that in order to succeed, they're going to need networks, they're going to need mentors, they're going to need to know, who can I go to ask these questions? And it doesn't have to be within race mentorship groups. The Black Female Coach Mentorship Program is just one example, but the athletes are really pushing for being able to be connected with others who look like them, who share their experience, who will believe them, who they don't have to explain every little detail of their experience to, because other people who look like them will have gone through similar things, but they also will know how to navigate these complex colonial structures that are our universities. And so they're looking for support, for education from others. And I'm really proud of some of the work that we've done in our Ideas Research Lab at University of Toronto. We're really close with the BIPOC Varsity Association. Some of the students work in my lab, and the ideas that they're bringing forth and the energy that they're bringing forth is really palpable. I think every activist group needs a excited 20-year-old who will help to drive the ideas.
Definitely. It's from a coaching standpoint and experiencing and seeing that on the ground, I'm in awe of these youth today. And then as a coach and knowing that I've had some really amazing mentors, it's definitely, for a multitude of reasons that you've discussed, a mentorship program for students, for athletes, for coaches, for individuals who want to get into higher up positions like administration. You don't know what you don't know, and so having somebody guide you in that process is awesome that those youth are doing that. We are running short on time, and so we're here. Let's talk about what do we do next. We have amazing individuals on the call, as you said, who are already doing great things, but in particular, when we say the word race and racism and anti-racism work, some people shy away. So let's talk about ways in which people can feel like they are contributing and or learn a little bit more about how to take some action.
Thanks for the opportunity. Well, the very last section of our report, we titled Tools for Change. And in our interviews and focus groups and the questionnaires, we asked this very question, like, what would you like to see? What could be different? How would your experience have changed or what would you have needed to make your experience different, particularly for the racialized athletes, coaches and administrators, and also for those who identify as white, many of whom were in positions of power. What do you need in order to do things differently? So we have a long list at the end of the report, really based on what people shared with us. But I titled the talk for today about policy, pedagogy, and practices, because I think those kind of encapsulate the overlapping nature of the themes that we put in the report. So in the report, the themes were about education, recruitment, supports, and accountability. And when we think about how policy affects each of those, we could come up with some ideas for, what structural, formal, write it down, it's now a rule, this is how we operate, what kinds of things could change to affect all of those. So I'll give just a few examples here, but really I think there's, the only limit is in our imagination. So in terms of, I've already mentioned the bursary that is being offered. And so thinking about, do you, as individual institutions, do we have policies in place so that, application forms, processes, so that students know how they can demonstrate their financial need and their heritage and leverage these bursaries? Do your institutions have a formal, clear complaint process? So many people told us that they would never complain about racism because of the backlash, because there is no place to do so, because there is no one to go to, because they would not receive the mental health supports, or the mental health supports that are in place are with people who have no experience with sport and no experience with race and racism, or a limited cultural competency around mental health supports for racialized peoples. So, thinking about, who is on your staff and how are they positioned to help? Do they have the tools that they need? That's what I mean when I say policy. Are your hiring processes and anti-racism investigative processes standardized in some way so that people know what they can expect when they come forward or when they interview? The idea that a policy is only punitive or what we also heard was that the first step of addressing racism is for the person who's experienced racism to confront their oppressor. And that puts a lot of burden on junior people, on younger people, on part-time coaches. That puts a lot of burden on them. So how can we get those who have more security and safety involved in a deeper way in addressing specific complaints? And when complaints are made, or several complaints are made against a particular person or within a particular sport, what are the ways that we can actually leverage this as learning instead of this person coming forward, then this person coming forward, and nobody's talking to each other. So I think there are really structural ways that we can do that. One of those is through equity specialists. In the report, we recommend the hiring of, and people use the acronym EDI, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Specialist, specific to the athletic department, and having this person either, or I shouldn't say either, they might work on complaints processes, but they might also work on programming and training. And also, even when I use those words, I kind of recoil a little bit like, ooh, training, you're going to train me to be anti-racist. But that training could be a formal workshop. It could be a webinar like this. It could be a social media campaign. It could be, conversations that are happening at coaches' meetings and between coaches and their athletes at their own meetings and training. So it could be formal and informal, text-based and visual-based. I really want people to be creative about what that education can look like, but I also want it enshrined in policy. Like, this is the person whose job it is to do this work, or to support a group of students, a network of people to do this work, because we don't want it all to be on the shoulders of one person, but many institutions have 0 people. And I know, of course, across Ontario, our institutions are of various sizes and different capacities to create new positions, but despite those differences, we need to be reflecting on, what do we have? What is at our disposal? Who could we put in these positions? Because when these ideas or positions are enshrined in policy, then when new people come, or, when an old leader leaves, the actual practice gets to stay. I really think that that's an advantage of making it formal. And so I'll just move on to the next point about pedagogy. I think, as I've already mentioned, the learning that needs to take place, the anti-racism literacy that needs to take place, there's a high need for that. So we need to shift the culture about talking about racism. As you said, some people kind of recoil, or they think, oh, that's not my work to do. Particularly if they've never experienced racism, then they say, how could I be the anti-racist leader? But we absolutely need everyone on board. And, just as we've shifted the culture around talking about concussion or talking about sexual assault, recognizing that these things happen in sport, and we need a strategy to be able to talk about them comfortably with each other and to deal with them. So, it can't be hidden racism. It can't be secret. There's no reason for us to be bearing the burden, us racialized people to be bearing that burden individually. So I think, shifting the learning, the pedagogy around meritocracy, the idea that we're only hiring the best people and yet having no clear criteria of how we're defining best, but looking around and seeing that, most of the people that we've hired are coming from a similar background. And I mean that background racially, but also academically and culturally, and in terms of class and ability. We need to really shift our ideas. So ideas about racism, about meritocracy, about whose job it is, about how we shoulder tap people for opportunities, about how we specifically target different population groups when we are advertising. I know many universities are doing hard work to try and get underrepresented staff hired and to recruit differently. Some are just thinking about this for the first time. I heard from many coaches that say, we always recruit from these 2 clubs. These 2 clubs have the best athletes, so why would I go anywhere else? But these 2 clubs have the best athletes that all look the same and have the same experiences. And so, some of our sports are really limited, as I've mentioned already, in terms of a talent pipeline. We're missing out on great talent because we haven't considered other sources. And then the last thing in terms of our practices, which really overlaps with the pedagogy and the policy, is that, thinking about how we can do things differently in terms of the everyday, navigating what people are saying is invisible, making it broadly shared, showing people how they can build their own confidence through their networks, really uncovering the layers of how did I get to this position, and how can I share that the privileges that I have with a broader range of people, but also recognizing and not making assumptions about the backgrounds that people who are racialized, the backgrounds that they're bringing. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? We know that our university cultures are colonially driven and are hard to change, but they're not impossible. And so we need to think, about our micro practices, about day by day, how can I do things differently? Where can I learn? And notice I didn't say who can I learn from. So we need to take the burden off of our racialized student athletes, coaches, and administrators, and share that knowledge. There's so much that's available broadly that will help us with those daily practices in order to shift. So maybe I'll leave it there. I want to leave some time for question. I know I tend to go on, but I'm just so excited about this. So thank you for the questions and for the opportunity.
I am actually going to ask for a little bit of assistance from our co-hosts, just in terms of tackling if anything's coming through the chat, but so I'm having some issues with my screen. So please, if you have any questions, Dr. Kerr and Dr. Joseph there, I will leave it to you to just sort of take the reins and allow people a couple of minutes to share their thoughts or perspectives or questions.
Thanks, Deniece. We have a couple of moments for questions from participants. If you'd like to raise your hand, I hope I can see everyone here. Oh, here's a question. Thank you for this session. How can we support students without feeling pushed away due to our different backgrounds?
So I think there's lots of context there, but I think the relationship is not going to start in a crisis. So I wonder if there are ways that we can integrate, for example, integrating mental health professionals within team culture, or having opportunities for administrators to sit with and meet with athletes. We heard from many athletes like, I don't even know who the athletic director is, but then if there's a problem and things get escalated to that athletic director, they might be meeting them for the first time. So I think, across our many different kinds of differences, not just racial differences, we really need to think about our relationships, all of our relations, and the ways that we can connect with each other as people, and then go from there.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like being proactive and developing relationships before a crisis triggers the first interaction.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? I'm not seeing anything. Maybe I could ask a question then. Oh, sorry. Cindy, would you like to ask a question?
Sure, since we have this great opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, how do we, thinking about the change that needs to happen, how do we maintain this sense of urgency to kind of keep our foot on the pedal and, to continue to keep this on the agenda and moving things forward? Any advice for us, either as leaders or as organizations?
Yeah, I'll come back to the student athletes and the more creative ways of sharing their experiences. I think there's an opportunity for it to go to the back burner when it's no longer in your face. It might be easier for you to forget, but I think for those who are experiencing racism on a regular basis, they're not forgetting, right? And so then they might be becoming more silent. So I think in structural ways, creating a seminar series, or, on a regular basis at coaches meetings, making sure that it's always part of the agenda And particularly if there are big initiatives coming up. I know some schools are running anti-racism conferences, and then that, you know, the lead up to that keeps it on the agenda for many months at a time. I think, you know, we need to find ways to integrate it into what we're doing. You know, think about the things that you don't forget, right? We don't forget our monthly payroll. We don't forget, you know, there's lots of things that we never allowed to be not urgent. And so what are the structures that are in place for those things? And could we apply an anti-racism lens for those to that?
Thanks, Janelle.
Thanks very much, Janelle. You know that you've just invited more commitments from yourself to help us in that journey. Well, I know that we could easily continue this dialogue for many more hours, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you so much, Janelle, for sharing your expertise and sharing it in such a impactful and motivating manner. You've given us so much to think about, and perhaps more importantly, you've given us strategies to act and to do better. So we're grateful to both you, Janelle, and Deniece for spending this time with us. And to our participants, thank you so much for joining us today. And please stay tuned for our next E-Alliance Equity Matters webinar, which will be coming shortly. And in the meantime, I hope everyone stays well. Have a great day, and bye for now.